Hello everyone, it's Daniel from TechMindFactory and welcome to this new video from the series called Modern Identity powered by Azure. In this video, I would like to talk about B2B versus multi-tenant applications in Microsoft Entra ID. Before you watch this video, I strongly recommend watching my previous video in which I describe some concepts and differences related to single-tenant and multi-tenant applications in Microsoft Entra ID. In this video specifically, we are going to talk about business-to-business or B2B applications and differences between those applications and multi-tenant applications in Microsoft Entra ID. So let's start. As always, before we will jump into some practical demos, let's talk a little bit about theory. What is B2B feature in Microsoft Entra ID? B2B or business-to-business feature is collaboration feature within Microsoft Entra External ID that lets you invite guest users to collaborate within your organization. With B2B collaboration, you can securely share your company's applications and services with external users while maintaining control over your own corporate data. Work safely and securely with external partners, large or small, even if they don't have Microsoft Entra ID or an IT department. So that's very important. You can collaborate with external people outside your organizations, and those people do not have to have Microsoft Entra ID for their organizations. And we will see why in a minute. So, moving forward, let's talk a little bit about B2B collaboration. So, when we have organization and this organization has Microsoft Entra ID tenant, basically what we can do, we can invite guest user to such tenant. And now, obviously, the simple mechanism in Microsoft Entra ID is to provide email and send the collaboration invitation to such person. And such a person will receive invitation, can redeem it, and then a person can access our Entra ID tenant and obviously organization's resources. Now, the case is that with B2B collaboration, there can be different kinds of external users. Obviously, those can be external users from other Entra ID tenants, but obviously it can happen that person has personal Microsoft account and this person would like to access our corporate resources with this specific account. Or there can be even a situation where we will enable B2B collaboration using Google or Facebook accounts, because that's possible with B2B collaboration. So we can either invite such person or enable sign-up flow or self-service sign-up flow, how it is called. So in this specific scenario, when we will enable this self-service sign-up flow, users can access our application, but before that, they will have to go through the sign-up process. And during this sign-up process, users have chance to decide which account they will use to collaborate with us, with our organization within Microsoft Entra ID. The user type for these B2B collaboration users is typically set to guest, and their user principal name contains the external identifier. Yes, like this EXT identifier. So that's how we can see basically and discover that this is the guest account. Okay, so now important facts about B2B. There are no credentials associated with B2B collaboration users. This is very important to be mentioned. Like, when we have a standard user in Microsoft Entra ID, obviously we have username, password, obviously we can use passwordless and other authentication options. But the case is that with B2B, we are inviting person to our tenant, and this person will not have any credentials within our Entra ID tenant. Guest users authenticate with their home organization or identity provider, and then your organization checks the guest user's eligibility for B2B collaboration. And that's very important because, as you remember, I mentioned on the previous slide that user can use another Entra ID account, user can use personal Microsoft account, user can use Facebook, can use Google, or any email address with one-time passcode. So that's very important to be mentioned, that there can be different kinds of accounts used with B2B feature. And obviously we can decide which of those identity providers are supported. Use B2B collaboration when you need to let external users access your Office 365 applications, software as a service applications, and line of business applications, basically. We can invite users to B2B collaboration using their Microsoft Entra ID accounts, Microsoft accounts, or social identities like Google or Facebook. This is what I mentioned before. So in this specific scenario, as you can see, there are multiple options users can access, and they can authenticate before they can access our corporate resources. Okay, next important fact is that we can use self-service sign-up user flows to let external users sign up for applications themselves. So as you remember, I mentioned, like with typical B2B feature or guest invitation, we are sending such invite to user, and user will have to redeem this invite, and then we will create guest account for such user in Microsoft Entra ID tenant, and user can start using or accessing corporate resources of our organization. But the case is that in a modern, I would say, workplace, you can also enable self-service sign-up user flows. So in such case, before user can even access specific application or resource, user will have to go through the sign-up process. And during this sign-up process, we can collect some additional attributes for the user, like let's say first name, last name, city, and also user can decide which identity provider user will use. This can be external account like Microsoft Entra ID account. It can be Facebook, as I mentioned, or Microsoft account. The experience can be customized to allow sign up with a work, school, or social identity like Google or Facebook. Yeah. So basically, this is very important. Like again, we can control how this sign-up flow will look like. We can say like, okay, we want to only support external accounts from other Microsoft Entra ID tenants. But also we can say like, okay, we want to support external accounts from Entra ID, including personal accounts like Microsoft accounts. But also we can make it, I would say, more fancy, and we can say, okay, we will support all external accounts from Entra ID tenants, personal accounts, Microsoft accounts, but also we will provide this option to sign in with Facebook and Google. So, as I mentioned before, we can also collect information about the user during the sign-up process. That's very important to be mentioned. So we can display those additional text boxes on the sign-up flow. So before user can access the resource, user will have to provide additional details related to the profile, like first name, last name, or city. Okay, so that was about the B2B, basically. And now let's talk a little bit more about multi-tenant applications. So multi-tenant applications are available to users in both their home tenant and other Microsoft Entra ID tenants. So at first glance, we can see that it's quite similar to B2B. Yeah, like we have application. This application can be accessed by our corporate users from Entra ID, a tenant that we own, but also we can make it possible to external users to sign up and then use this application. And with multi-tenant applications, the flow is quite similar, but believe me, there are some important differences here. With multi-tenant applications, it means that users from external organizations that use Microsoft Entra ID will be able to log in and access the application. And now when we register such application in Microsoft Entra ID tenant, we have to select accounts in any organizational directory, so any Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So basically all users and guests with a work or school account from Microsoft can use our application or API. This includes schools or businesses that use Microsoft 365. And here I really recommend watching my previous video about single tenant apps and multi-tenant apps in Microsoft Entra ID. This option is recommended if your target audience is business or educational customers, external users in general. So as you can see, this can be tough, yeah, to make this decision like, okay, should I create multi-tenant application or should I use B2B feature in Microsoft Entra ID? So let's talk a little bit more about it. So what is the difference then? Yeah, I mean, we have B2B, we have multi-tenant applications. For both options, we can use external user accounts. That's hard, yeah? So let's talk. What are the benefits of using B2B? When using B2B feature or business to business, we talk about single tenant application. That's very important. Like when we talk about B2B feature, we talk about single tenant application still. So there is nothing like service principal provisioning, as we will talk in a minute about. There is nothing that is happening in external ID tenants. We still talk about single tenant application when it comes to B2B. It means that it's much simpler to implement such application. It's confirmed, yes, like implementing single tenant applications is basically much easier than implementing multi-tenant applications. Again, why? I strongly recommend watching my previous video. No additional effort to block guest external users. Yes, so in this specific scenario, we can say like, okay, we want to block this specific guest user. We can use our Azure portal or Entra admin center for that. That's it. With multi-tenant applications, obviously, there is more work because we have to decide from which tenant we want to block specific user. It can be more tricky, basically. It's good, I mean, B2B is good when number of guest users is relatively small. So that's very important information. If we know that, there will be a small amount of people that would like to access our application or resource, then B2B can be a good fit. There is no need to provision service principal in any external Microsoft Entra tenant. So, as you remember in my previous video, if you watched it, I said that during the multi-tenant implementation, we have to provision service principal in the customer's tenant, basically, in the user's tenant. So what is happening here, this is the diagram from my previous video, but the most important part here is related to application and service principal. Application is just a template. You create application, you register it, and you can say like, okay, this application is multi-tenant application, not single tenant application. And now obviously if external users will try to access this application, they will try to log in, they will use common endpoint to do it. I mean authorization endpoint. And what will happen there underneath the service principal, so the instance of the application will be created in the user's tenant. So we have home tenant, developer's tenant, where application is registered, but obviously the service principal has to be created in the user's tenant to make it possible for the user or users to use it. So as you can see, it's more tricky. With multi-tenant application, we have to also provision the service principal in another Entra ID tenant. With B2B feature or single tenant application, because B2B feature is about single tenant applications, we only create service principal in our Entra ID tenant. So there is not a big deal, especially when we are registering our application through the Azure portal or Entra admin center, because of the fact that service principal is provisioned along with application template creation. Okay, so what are the disadvantages for B2B? I mean, when it's better to use multi-tenant applications. It can be challenging to manage large amount of guest accounts in Microsoft Entra ID tenant. There is a big administrative effort increased. And yeah, that's the problem here. I think like everyone, like not only administrators, but basically people who will manage Entra ID, they don't want to, have large amount of guest users to manage in the future, because this can be really tricky. There is no access to data stored in the guest user home tenant using Microsoft Graph API. This is really, really important. So I will repeat it. There is no access to data stored in the guest user's home tenant using Microsoft Graph API. It means that if we have our B2B feature enabled and we have application that is basically secured by our Entra ID tenant and B2B feature is enabled for this application, It means that if we will try to use Graph API to get any data that is stored in the guest user home tenant, it will not be possible. So that's why we should use multi-tenant application in such scenario, because it will not be possible for us to get anything from the home tenant of this guest user account with B2B feature. So we can only use Graph API to, query our own Entra ID tenant where B2B feature is enabled, basically. Licensing cost can increase in the tenant where B2B access is enabled. Yeah, like this is very important. There are multiple features in the Entra ID that can require specific license, and it can be tricky because of the fact that sometimes the cost can increase, basically. So again, B2B can be tricky here, so that's better to think about implementing multi-tenant application. User lifecycle management can be challenging again. Yes, obviously, like right now in Entra ID, we have this governance suite, and we can, manage different kinds of users and so on. But still, managing lifecycle of such guest users using B2B feature can be tricky here. So it's better to think about multi-tenant application in this specific scenario, because in such case, user account is still managed by our home tenant. Yeah. So in this specific scenario, we delegate this effort of lifecycle management to this home tenant for this guest account. So in our Entra ID tenant for this guest user, we don't have to worry about what will happen with this account? Should we remove it at some point, and so on? Yeah. So this can be also challenging when it comes to user lifecycle management. Okay, now really quickly about the login experience here. So on the left side, you can see multi-tenant application login. So if we implemented multi-tenant application and we click login button, we are redirected to the common endpoint. Here we have to provide our email address, and obviously what we can do, we can also click sign in options, and we see those options here, and basically we can use one of them. Yeah, sign in with Windows Hello or security key, sign into organization. So we can even search for the organization and for the specific domain related to Microsoft Entra ID tenant. And obviously there is also this small link, can access your account. So then we can recover the access to our account if it's enabled. But as you can see, there is no option to create any account. Yeah. So on the right side, we have B2B app login. So this is the login page that is displayed for our application that is secured by B2B feature in Microsoft Entra ID. And as you can see, this screen is quite similar to the screen we see on the left side, but there are some small differences. First of all, you can see that there is this question, no account, create one. Yeah. So in this specific scenario, we can create guest user account in our Entra ID tenant where we have B2B feature enabled for this application. And also what we can do when we click sign in options, we have additional options to sign in, like sign in with GitHub, sign in with Facebook. Obviously, if I add other identity providers like Google, I can sign in with Google too, or sign up if this is like a first time. So that's the difference here. Yes, this is the self-service sign up. So I can decide, okay, so with which account types users will be able to sign up and eventually use my B2B application. Now let's talk a little bit more about tokens differences. That's very important. I mean, like differences in the tokens for B2B and multi-tenant applications. So let's start with B2B and ID token differences. When we decode the ID token that was issued to the application that is secured by B2B feature in Microsoft Entra ID, we will see two claims, issuer and TID or tenant ID. And here we can see that this is the ID of our Microsoft Entra ID tenant where we enable B2B feature for the application. So this is our Entra ID tenant ID, not the ID of the guest user tenant. Now, if we want to check which method or with which identity provider user authenticated, we have to look into the IDP claim. And this IDP claim contains information about identity provider that was used during the authentication. In this specific scenario, we can see that this guest user account is from another Microsoft Entra ID tenant with this specific identifier. And obviously, if we would use Facebook for authentication under IDP, we would see Facebook. So that's the difference about the ID token in B2B. So that can be tricky. So the issuer is our tenant, not the user home tenant, the guest user home tenant, I mean. If we want to see it, we have to check IDP claim. Now, let's talk about the ID token that is issued to the multi-tenant application. Again, here is the decoded token. As we can see, we have two claims, issuer and TID or tenant ID. And those two claims contain information about the Microsoft Entra ID, tenant ID of the user that was signing in to the multi-tenant application. So as you remember, I mentioned that with multi-tenant application, first we have to provision service principal from our application, and then users will be able to use multi-tenant application and sign in to this multi-tenant application with their accounts in their home Entra ID tenant. So in this specific scenario, as we can see, the issuer and TID is about the Entra ID tenant ID of the user. And we do not have any IDP claim here because this is our tenant, yeah, for which we provision service principal of the multi-tenant application. Now, if we look into access token differences when it comes to B2B, situation is quite the same like for the ID token. So again, we have issuer, we have the TID claim. So here, this is again our Microsoft Entra ID tenant ID, where we enable B2B feature for the application. And if we want to check who issued, basically like which method user used to authenticate, we have to use IDP claim. And here we will find the information about the identity provider. In this case, again, this is another Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So this guest user is from this specific Entra ID tenant with this ID. Okay, and now when we will look into multi-tenant application access token differences, again, situation is quite similar like for the ID token. Issuer and TID claims contain information about the user's home tenant, basically. So in this specific scenario, again, we do not have any IDP claim and so on, because of the fact that this is multi-tenant application, service principal is provisioned for such application in the user tenant, and that's why issuer and TID claims are always about the ID of the user's home Microsoft Entra ID tenant. Okay. So, before we will continue, one last thing. As you remember, I mentioned that with B2B feature, we cannot filter any data from the guest user home tenant. And that's the reason, yeah? Because the token is issued by our tenant, where we enable B2B feature. So there is no possibility to access any resources and filter any data from the guest user tenant in this specific scenario. So it's worth again to think about it, like should we use B2B really, or should we target into multi-tenant application? And that's why again I strongly recommend watching my previous video about single tenant and multi-tenant applications in Microsoft Entra ID. Okay, perfect. So right now it's time to see it in action. So let's see B2B and multi-tenant applications. So let's start. Let's start with Microsoft Entra Admin Center. As I mentioned before, B2B application is nothing else than single tenant application. So that's why under app registrations, we have to register new application, and from the supported account types, we have to select accounts in this organizational directory only. I've already created TMF B2B application. It's registered. As you can see here under application client ID, I have unique client ID that I will use in the application configuration to successfully authenticate users. But before that, please note that under External Identities tab in the Microsoft Entra Admin Center, when you click User Flows, you can define new self-service sign-up flow. So here I click New User Flow. I've already registered one, so let me show you the existing flow I have here. It's called Sign Up, Sign In. And as you can see, under Identity Providers here, I selected Facebook, email one-time passcode, and obviously Azure Active Directory sign-up or Entra ID sign-up is selected by default. So it means that with those accounts, users will be able to sign up and then access my B2B application. Important fact is that to enable B2B login, I mean self-service sign-up flow for the applications, under this specific flow, under external identities, we have to select applications section, and from there we have to click add application. And as you can see here, I've added TMF B2B application. So it means that when I will try to access this application, then this sign up, sign in flow will be triggered, and I will have those different sign in options available to me. Okay, perfect. So now let's launch the application and let's see it in action. Okay, so here is my Blazor application. It's my B2B application, basically. And from there, I will click Login button. Now I'm redirected to the authorization endpoint of my Entra ID tenant. And here, obviously, I could use my corporate account. Yes, from this local Entra ID tenant. But I will use another account. I will use external account that exists in another Microsoft Entra ID tenant. So it will be tester account from the Formula 5 Dev Entra ID tenant. I will click Next button, and then I should be asked to provide the password. So I will type the password and I will click Sign In button. And after a few seconds, I have this information. This account does not exist in this organization. Enter a different account or create a new one. And this is the power of B2B and self-service sign-up flow in the Microsoft Entra ID tenant. Because when I will click create a new one, I have those options to create account. As you remember, in the Entra Admin Center, I decided which identity providers I want to use and connect with my self-service sign-up flow. So I can either use the email to sign up, or I can sign up with Facebook. In this specific case, I will use this external account from another Entra ID tenant. I will click Next button. Here I have to provide password again to log in. And then after a few seconds, there are permissions displayed. And those permissions are to inform to which data this ML04 tenant would like to access. I mean, like which data this specific tenant requires to move forward with this account creation. So I can review those permissions here, and I can click Accept button. And after that, I will move forward with the next screen. So here, additional details are required. What I can do in my self-service sign-up flow in the Microsoft Entra External ID, I can define additional attributes that I will collect from the user before the account is created. So that's why I decided to collect given name and surname. So I will provide those details here, and I will click Continue button. And now, before I can successfully access this application, I have to also review the permissions that are specifically for this specific B2B application. So this application is accessing my single tenant API. This application would like to view the basic profile and maintain access to data you have given access to, or I given access to. So I will click Next. This is also the consent screen for my single tenant API because I would like to access it. I will click Accept, And then after I successfully consented, then I'm successfully authenticated. My guest account is created in my local Entra ID tenant. Sign-in process is complete. And right now, when I will scroll down, I can see all the claims in the ID token that was returned. And again, please remember that this ID token was returned from my Entra ID tenant. So here under issuer, yes, and under TID claim, I see my Entra ID tenant ID. If I want to check the authentication method used by the guest user, I have to use IDP claim. And here I can see that this specific user, I mean tester account, is from Entra ID tenant with this identifier. Okay, perfect. So this is about the B2B experience from the application side. So as I mentioned, because of the fact that we have this self-service sign-up flow and we have those options to collect additional attributes, we can make it easier to external people to sign up and access our B2B applications. Perfect. So right now, let's see the experience for the multi-tenant application. So let's switch to multi-tenant application. Here is my multi-tenant Blazor application. Let's click login button. And as we can see, we are redirected to the common endpoint. Again, I strongly recommend watching my previous video where I described some details and differences between single tenant apps and multi-tenant apps in Microsoft Entra ID. But the case is that in multi-tenant application scenario, we are redirected to the common endpoint. Why? Because we don't know from which tenant user will come. So in this specific scenario, we have to discover it first. Please also note that there is a difference between screens. Like in the B2B flow or self-service sign-up flow, we had this button, don't have account, create one. Yes, and we had this chance to create account, guest account. In the multi-tenant application scenario, there is no guest account. User will just use the account from his or her native Entra ID tenant and then will access this specific application because underneath service principal will be provisioned in the user's tenant. So here, when I will again try to use the tester account from another Entra ID tenant, I will click next button. I have to provide the password. I will click sign in button. And right now, what will happen? The consent screen should be displayed. Yeah. So as we can see, this specific TMF multi-tenant application would like to sign you in and read your profile. So there is also information that if you accept, TMF multi-tenant API will also have access to your user profile information because this application is calling API. In this video, this is not so important. Again, you will find details in my previous video. But again, I have to accept those permissions. And now what's happening underneath, the service principal is provisioned in my tenant, in the user's tenant, basically. And because of the fact that only administrators can approve those permissions in the tester account tenant, that's why I have to switch to admin account. So let me do it really quickly. So I will click have an admin account, sign in with this account. So I will do it right now. And I will click use another account. From there, I will type global administrator account. I will provide the password for this account. And obviously, I have to accept the MFA. So I'm doing this right now. And after a few seconds, then I have consent screen again. Yes. So as global administrator, I can accept those permissions. I cannot do it as an user because of the fact that permissions in the tenant, in the formal dev tenant, are set. So only global administrators can accept those permissions from multi-tenant applications. So here I can click consent on behalf of your organization. So I'm consenting on behalf of my organization, the whole organization. So users will not be asked again to consent. I will click accept button. And right now, underneath, service principals are provisioned for web application and web API. And now, after that, I'm successfully authenticated. The authentication is completed. And if I scroll down, I can see decoded ID token. And I can see all the claims. And important fact is that there is no IDP claim anymore, like in B2B scenario. I have only issuer and TID claim here, and value here and here is matching this user's home tenant ID. So in this specific scenario, that's the difference between multi-tenant application and B2B application. So perfect. So right now, once I'm authenticated, I can also call the API. I can also use Microsoft Graph API to query different data and resources within this tenant because of the fact that the token was issued by user's tenant, not like in a B2B scenario by the tenant in which guest user was created for the user. One important fact and detail, in case of multi-tenant application, we have to provision service principal in the user's home tenant, as I mentioned before. So that's why when we tried to sign in to multi-tenant application, once administrator granted consents, then 2 enterprise applications were registered. As you can see under enterprise applications, we can see those 2 service principals for the multi-tenant application and for the multi-tenant API. So that's the difference. Yes, so in the user's home tenant, we have to first provision those service principals for the applications, for the multi-tenant applications. In case of B2B, there is no service principal provisioning. So if user signed up and user accessed our B2B application, in the user's home tenant, no service principal will be provisioned, because B2B application is single tenant application. So the service principal for the B2B application only exists in the tenant where B2B application was registered. Now let's see one more thing. On the other side, this is Entra ID tenant where I registered B2B application. And now, as you remember, I signed up with the tester account from Formula 5 Dev. So that's why under users, I can find this tester account. The case is that user type is set to guest. For the identities, we can see external Azure AD, and also we can see this ext fragment, yes, in the user principal name. So this is the indication that this is external user. So every time such user signs up using the self-service sign-up flow in the Entra ID, user account will be mirrored here. Obviously without any password, but still we have this information that a guest user was created within our Entra ID tenant. Okay, perfect. So that's it about B2B and multi-tenant applications. I hope you found this video interesting and helpful. And thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next videos.